in another way, right? It's like, do I want handmade toothpaste or do I want the ones made by Crest in a factory that no human touches, right? Versus someone who spins a vet and, maybe a beard hair falls in every once in a while and you look in the mirror with one between your teeth, right? So I think I think it depends on it. But let's say you were talking about articles and things of that nature. I guess if you were to break it down, and let's say this is part of like that resistance moment from 0 to 30 years of that change, or however long it takes to make that transition, why would you want to deal with the biases? And you see this today in different news outlets. There's this underlying bias or way that information is portrayed where you could, potentially derive the writer or the author's thoughts on how they view things, right? So, and also, let's say instead of me waiting for the author to finish their coffee and finally sit down in their own busy life to generate, that article or piece, what if it was more instant and based on more recent things? So many times you'll pull up an article and it may be on something breaking, some breaking news, and things develop so quickly, by the time the article is written and in front of you, it's already out of date. So versus like a system that could generate things more quickly, reference more data, and get things out quicker. So, I think some people may want that, but I think what's kind of interesting there is, let's say in the future, something as simple as a book that you could generate just by a simple query, and it's developed in the way that you want to read it. Are people going to want to go back and look at previous books, or are those going to be crunched up and, plugged into the new books that are being created, right? Some people like to go and watch movies from, earlier times, right? And they appreciate the black and white and the lack of CGI and things like that. And that's more of a kind of novelty type of thing. But who knows? I mean, I think that it'll be interesting. There's, people will be upset when it's something that affects them, people they know, if those things move quickly. But then the new generation, the turnover of life, which, it will bring someone in with fresh eyes, barring that people don't live forever. But, and people will forget those fights and that resistance because they'll move in the path of the least resistance, and I think that's, typically when you look at, how, any engineer or architect or anyone studying kind of structures, that it'll break where there's the easiest path for it to break, right? So like if you were to crease a paper and then try to rip it, it's more likely to rip across the crease that's already been kind of weakened in order to rip it, right? So in the future, people are going to go towards that crease. They're not going to try and create a new crease just to make a rip as well, right? So, I just think the turnover there is a lot of that stuff gets wiped away, and people look at things in fresh eyes with a new status quo. The issue is you kind of lose that historical value and maybe understanding the fundamentals, but maybe part of how it's generated in the future, like the information itself, will include some of those things. Barring it doesn't go against whatever the new agenda is.
Sure. I mean, in some ways, to talk about it differently, I think we do live in exciting times, right? So for example, earlier this week, I think it was the MIT Technological Review talked about AI-developed drugs, right? That AI is starting to develop different types of drugs that have never been seen before, and it's the company involved in particular is really less interested in a particular drug here or there, but revolutionizing the whole cycle of how we research and find new medicines, right? And in kind of shortening that process via AI understood, simulative environments that obviously have to be tested on, at a human level to understand efficacy, right? but being able to kind of shorten that timeline, and maybe also being able to yield, the holy grail of drugs is really having things that are hyper customizable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both in terms of benefits and reduced side effects. So,
Mm-hmm.
there's a particular pill, available for Roy Peer that you take,
Mm-hmm.
and there's another pill that I take, right? And each of these are at a unit basis, right? Like a unit of one,
Mm-hmm.
right? Designed unit of one, but targeted particularly to the unique reality that a particular individual's body is,
Right.
right?
Right.
And as a result has a better upside and fewer downside, right? Sides,
Mm-hmm.
if you will, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just like the entertainment, the information, the other subjects. I mean, when you see now these commercials for certain drugs, right? They're never targeted. That's why they're mainly just on TV, and I think that may be a legal constraint that they can only advertise in certain areas. But there's always that guy who speaks really quick at the end who lists all the side effects, and so why does that same drug affect some people and give them a heart attack, and another people clear their acne, right? So, or whatever the drug may be. So those are questions that I think are what you're saying, or where you're what you're alluding to is essentially that if you know the person's genetic makeup and you can test that through some kind of AI simulator that was able to understand those basic genetics and responses and things like that. And I mean, there's also like another level to this, right? There's also potentially your genetics, but then also maybe your health and what you're eating. And if all those things are, hey, this drug works great, but only if you stop eating so much salt and
Mm-hmm.
cholesterol and whatever, it'll have a different reaction to someone who's, eating a different diet. So, I mean, I think those are super exciting. I mean, really like there's, I guess, problems we don't know we have, but it seems like a lot of the problems, and we've already solved a lot of other problems, a lot of diseases today that can be solved by an antibiotic. We're solving, but sometimes when you look at the past, you might say, how could people have lived the way they did? Like they didn't have this technology or that technology, but during the time they lived thinking likely that they were at the height of their technological standpoint, and that would be true because they don't know what the future is, just like we don't. But we can kind of, I think in the future people will really look back and say, how the hell did people entertain themselves by watching these old style of making films, or how did people go through life and not track their genomics and tweak their DNA to solve issues and all these things, and all these potential limitations would get solved. So, and I think one way you look at it is, what are these limitations, and then that drives or problems creates those opportunities, right? And you could say it's the same with business, right? It's but with also everything else as far as health, the amount of time you have, the quality of life you have. So there's already studies being done on aging and cells, stopping them from aging or potentially even reversing the speed in which they age or move back, right? So there could be a whole set of issues that are removed because maybe cancer only develops at a certain stage of life, let's say, whatever, call it 40, 50 years, that's when the cells are essentially conducive to allowing those cancerous cells to develop out. So if those are able to be reversed, or you kind of remove that whole bucket of issues, and again, I think the biggest source of trouble is going to be the resistance from the current established people that are benefiting from the current status of, if you're a creator of a drug, and you're making billions of dollars and have enormous power and lobbying power, would you push against the creation of something that would stop the aging of cells that would make your company obsolete? I think that would be probably the normal human response, is to defend your home, right?
Mm-hmm.
But is it better for the greater humanity? So the fact that those people exist and have to put up a resistance, I think is something that eventually gets washed away as new generations come in. So that's also a negative side of people living forever is you stop looking at things with fresh eyes that maybe a child would if you've already been kind of forged in stone.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Another example I was reading about yesterday was, going back to space. Apparently, there's an individual over at NASA, and he said he was inspired by watching the sci-fi show The Expanse, right? But what he's using is a generative AI system to engineer component parts with different kind of variable dimensionality to it, right? And these components, they make sense, but they also look quite alien, right? And it's another form of kind of, so for example, some of the parameters might be, I think off the top of my head, it's like, there's going to be a 5 kilogram load, right, reinforced over here, but this component has to be able to withstand 60 G's of force, right? Spit something out. And kind of like going back to the drug example in terms of being able to truncate or speed up the production and testing of new drugs, right? It can iterate quite quickly, right? And produce, generative iterations that can then be tested, right? At a much more rapid rate. So I think he was saying traditionally, like maybe a component, at best you could, do 2 a week, right, in terms of these different iterations. But this could maybe do 30, 40, 60 a week, right? Getting you far closer to more of an optimized output in a far shorter unit of time. That yields tremendous efficiencies when every ounce of weight counts, right? Particularly when you're talking about a launch environment, right?
Right. And one thing that could be interesting right now, we're seeing these AI programs and text and imagery, right? But if you then created that also in the physical world, right? Let's say, you could essentially take, on different levels, right? It could be on a supply chain standpoint, could be on a physical, 3D modeling standpoint, running those. Maybe even you don't even start to mold or sketch something, but you just say, create an object that can hold water, right? And then does it look like a cup, or maybe it's reimagined? So my schooling was I went to architecture school, and one of the first things they did was they didn't tell us to design a house. They told us to design a place to sleep, design a place to eat, and really the exercise there was, how do you think about what does it mean to eat? What conditions are set that allow a person to eat and do that, right? And I think there's 2 aspects to it. There's the number one is the actual kind of utility or functional standpoint of it. So, you could eat standing up, you could eat sitting down at a bar, wherever it is. And then after you've kind of accomplished those basic, functionality aspects to it, then there's also the aesthetic version and the experiential. So what is it like eating in a dungy alleyway with rats climbing out of a dumpster versus in a 5-star restaurant with waiters and all those, right? So that's more of the experiential. You're still eating in both, but the surrounding landscape is affected. So I think that would be interesting to see if you could use some kind of text input or something to then generate many different ways of experiencing. So or the experiential side of it after the functional side has been sufficiently created. And the same thing with the rocket launch, looking at, being able to withstand, like you mentioned, certain forces, you could build that out, but then is what it looks like important, right? If you had a certain country that was drawn more to the color red because it signified maybe a philosophy or something like that, and the AI spit something out that was green, you might say, let's just change the paint color because, just that gives it a different ambiance or experience to people viewing it, right?
Right. Right. Another thing Max talks about in his book is this idea of robo-judges, right? And that is AI systems that could, review different legal examples and come to an opinion. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah,
What are your thoughts?
are you good?
Yeah.
What?
No. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it would be interesting, right? Because like in cases, you might look at a certain based on the intention of the person, right?
Right.
Somebody who runs somebody over by accident is a manslaughter charge, but somebody who does it intentionally is murder, right? So, if you had some kind of metrics on what the person was thinking and feeling when they carried out such act, that would then affect the way that it would be ruled, right? So that's maybe kind of interesting, but then also taking into the account the person's thought, well-being, whatever it might be. Did they truly remember it? Because you can maybe somehow understand if the memory was written into a cell in their brain, or were they too intoxicated, or whatever it might be. But I think what he's saying is more so, one of the issues I think in our justice system is you have a lot of cases that are on the docket that judges can't get to.
Sure.
You have people who have potentially committed crimes who don't have the capital or the resources to get anything other than a public defender who's already got a lot on their plate.
Sure.
And you could say that there's people spending time behind bars that shouldn't, or maybe should have a lighter sentence if they had better representation.
Sure.
Right? There's also people who probably should not be around because of what they've done. So, and there's also this thing where there's a crime that's committed and then there's a long delay before they're sentenced. So the outrage that's maybe felt initially after, let's say, a family member is killed or a business is lost, maybe the 2 years of time between when that verdict is rung in has changed the way you viewed the situation. Now, is that good? And does that take away the severity of it because the time has allowed you to process that in one way or another?
Sure.
I don't know. But I guess, is that how he's speaking about robo judges?
Well, no, I think you hit a lot of it in different ways. I mean, he was talking about the fact that, different, yes, there's a case backlog in court systems and, the availability of having your day in court becomes its own constraint, right? Because that may take some time, but it would also be interesting to think about judges that also have a particular amount of domain expertise, right, related to the crime involved, right, and furthermore can maybe not just be able to apply this domain expertise, but have a more objective sense of jurisprudence than otherwise, right? And I think he highlights a couple of examples where, for example, statistically, certain judges have been known to, I believe, pass more lenient sentences after lunch than before lunch, right? And that's a very human reality, and we can kind of understand how that reality might exist. But it wouldn't be a reality that would affect a tireless, AI mechanism, right? Nor should it, right? Yeah.
They also say if you are going to schedule a surgery, you should schedule it earlier in the day versus later, just because of the attentiveness of the surgeon. And that may not always hold true, but whatever studies they've run, So, I would say, the human element, right? Let's say a judge just sees somebody in the defendant that is potentially somebody that affected them positively or negatively in their own life, you don't want that bias showing up. And it's kind of hard to really point that out because it's something that's maybe internal and,
Sure.
how are you to know that that judge's uncle looked like the defendant who abused them when they were younger or something,
Right.
I mean, as an example, right? Or if they don't like a certain race of people or have some preconceived notions or whatever it might be. So I think just like in the conversation earlier about removing some of these human, I don't know, what's the word, influential human emotions out of some of these systems to make them more efficient, that would probably be best. And also, why is somebody sitting in jail for X amount of months or maybe even years until they're even convicted of being guilty or not, right?
Sure.
So if somebody's guilty or not, if you could turn that around within a day or an hour or a week and able to access those pieces of information, you'd probably make everything more efficient. But you can't do that without the necessary tools to ensure that that's done correctly, right? Not saying it's being done correctly now or as efficient now, but being able to do that, I think, would make a big difference on the way people also commit crimes, right? If you know that like we've seen in some cities in the U.S., that your bail will be covered, and if you commit an act that could be pretty heinous, you'll be back on the street because of the bail reforms or whatever was implemented. I mean, you could just say, I already know once I do end up going in front of a judge for my initial act, I will be convicted for life or for many years or whatever. And then you spend the time between that day you end up in court doing other acts. I mean, that, is not a good incentive system. So I think it just comes down to how do you make it more efficient? Because when there's opportunity, typically for good or for bad, there's a chance people will go in that direction.
Sure. And in another direction as well, I think it made headlines in the context of the last month, this idea of being able to hire a robo-lawyer, right? Where, as we think about, at a certain point, you're going to be able to look more and more to these different AI systems or applications thereof, right?
Right.
Of being able to do specialized functions. So for example, you may have older digital photos, and there is whether we identify it as AI or machine learning example is capable of upscaling that photo into a much higher resolution, larger file size, right? And maybe kind of apply that to your whole data album, right? And as people become more and more comfortable looking to these niche AIs which again have particular domain focused capabilities, how again, maybe the digital lawyer is the good approach. The lawyer that is effectively a very large language model, having every single case, almost in every single language related to a topic, right, available to itself, and understanding, rules by jurisdiction, and historically being able to absorb all manner of arguments and counter arguments to your either claim or defense, right? If you will, right? At some point, is that maybe better than a human lawyer or not, right? I don't know.
Yeah, and there's something to be said about, let's look at the black and white example, which is two people were involved in some kind of incident that ended up in one person losing their life, right? And then you have a trial and lawyers who then examine the nuance of what happened, right? Was it self-defense? Was it a break-in? Was it an accident? Whatever it is, right? And then you have a jury that then, hears the facts of both sides, and makes a distinction. So, it's complicated. I don't think we're going to solve any issues on this podcast, but I think what we're going to do is just try to explore potentially what's possible. And, if there's any way that you can make it more efficient so that you can remove those collateral effects of the justice system, right? Which is, like we were saying earlier, people being stuck in jail while they wait to go on trial, or being let out early because of bail being posted.
Or the financial cost of legal
Right.
representation.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Because arguably, I can't imagine, access to a good AI system, right? Probably it's not the same hourly cost as a full legal team.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And that's a great point. I mean, that brings up, I think the beauty of, currently, if you don't have any resources, you're not going to get as good of a lawyer as somebody who is, like a celebrity lawyer, or somebody who comes in for these real high profile cases and sometimes can totally, change the way that everyone thinks a trial may or may not go. So if what you do is, instead of you have a system like that can equally represent both sides and truly find, present the cases in the same light, that totally changes everything. It really does democratize the idea of accessing those types of tools and resources from a law sense, but also all the other senses as well. So, we've talked about this before. King Henry V or whatever, couldn't walk into a bodega and look at rows and rows of food and have access to chocolates and fruits from different regions and stuff like that, because not only did preservatives not exist, but the global network of moving and transporting products and preservatives and things of that nature didn't exist during that time. And also, if somebody got polio before the polio vaccine, then they would be left with the disease and everything that comes from it. So the beauty of the technology of today, even though you may be on the lower rung of society, you may be living better than a king back then, right? And we've brought that up a few times, but I think it's you'll see those same gaps close in the future, where essentially from a law perspective or a resource perspective, people have access to all those similar tools without having the resources needed, because you need to access somebody's time versus accessing a program, which is wildly less expensive. Expensive to develop, expensive to implement, but once implemented, could be implemented everywhere.
Sure.
And then it becomes what is the use of those tools that becomes the differentiator, right? Like how much you decide to learn versus entertain yourself. Right.
And how that can be applied to different things. In the same way we think about top legal expertise, we can also think about top medical expertise, right?
Yeah.
The ability of a large language medical model that has literally read every single paper and further citations of papers related to your condition. Right. And is able to speak to that at a level that a specialist would be hard to replicate. Right. Another example could be, and by the way, when we come back to ChatGPT and GPT-3 more generally, it's very clear, as said before, that basically it's a language learning model that doesn't really have information available to it beyond the year 2021, right? And therefore, in no way, shape, or form should it be used for financial advice, right? Because, the particulates of what it quote unquote knows is in fact dated. But it would be interesting to think about, right? What if, in fact, one had the ability to kind of download your Quicken and or kind of TurboTax financial portfolio, right, into an AI model, right, that could give you real recommendations, right? And or actually including further education, right? Further and further iterations of financial literacy education, which, as we know, always continue further no matter where you are financially, right? And make that available to quote unquote the common man, right? Where you could have, a Bill Gates level trained financial advisor, right? Helping you understand conceptually what options may truly exist for you beyond just, here, click on this ad. Right.
Right.
And being able to do that in a very kind of holistic fashion and open up to you, a world of different opportunities that can be done through or utilized on the basis of some of these monies you've saved or other assets.
Right. And
including tax efficiency.
Right.
Things like that.
Well, I think where the initial thought that popped up there was, so today we have access to all this information. We could pull it up from our phone.
Sure.
But having someone who is an active advisor as far as answering questions, analyzing, giving you feedback, that is something that's missing, right? So, and I think people who typically are able to get ahead more quickly are using the access of mentors or somebody who's gone where they want to go or do what they want to do, right? So that could be interesting as far as today you've got the information in front of you, but you have no roadmap as far as what information is required each time or at every step of the way in order for you to better achieve whatever goal you'd like to achieve. So then having someone who was almost like an AI advisor that could then access and analyze all those different pieces, I think would be incredibly interesting and helpful. That way, almost like a guide or a teacher.
Sure.
What does a teacher do? They guide you, right? They're leading you through a subject, an idea, a problem. So I think having the guide is something that's difficult because obviously, a Bill Gates level advisor can't turn around and advise everyone on a personal level. They could put out a book that would then, generalize some of their philosophies and ideas, but having someone who could actually analyze your current status,
sure.
I mean, that I think that'd be incredible. There's also something to be said about, we're assuming that these systems are without issue, right? Or without fail, right? So what happens if you follow the AI to do X, Y, and Z, and then you lose everything or put yourself in a tough situation? So, I'm sure that could be fixed with a few clauses and warning labels, right?
But furthermore, too, I mean, remember an advisor, and you mentioned mentor, right? Advisors never. So, if I'm your advisor, right, you don't need nor should you just, take any advice blindly, right? It's advice that's food for thought, right? That, like anything, could prompt, follow-up questions and discussions, right? And that could iterate to even more optimal advice, or at the very least, more optimal understanding, right, of a particular facet of a larger topic, right? And there's value in that. We could all agree there's value in that, right? If you will, right?
100%. I think one of the issues with all this content that you see today, I've run a business, so I will typically listen to business podcasts and business figures and stuff like that. And one thing I've noticed is, whenever you're receiving any piece of advice, you have to understand the time frame in which it's given in relativity to where you are and also where that person is. So, like, for instance, someone may read that, Winston Churchill, drank tons of alcohol and smoked tons of cigars and did all of that stuff. But that may have been, maybe later in life, but earlier in his life, he was maybe not partaking in that. So if somebody would say, I want to be as great as Winston Churchill, and started drinking tons of whiskey all day and smoking cigars, but they did that at the wrong time, that could affect where they end up long term, right? So Or even, let's say you're getting advice from somebody who has $100 million business, but you have a $1 million business.
Mm-hmm.
The structures and the economies there are completely different.
Sure.
The systems are different. The personnels are different. Even in different industries, right? So if you're in let's say, a brick and mortar type of business, right? And then somebody else is in a internet marketing or advertising business, completely different. There's going to be some underlying things that you can pull nuggets from, but overall, I would say that you've got to be careful when you get that advice to understand where they are and where you are and where that relates.